In 1950, when Harlem was a city of contradictions, where hope and despair coexisted on every street corner, the FBI and prison authorities made a fatal mistake. They thought they could break the unbreakable. They thought that by chaining Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem's underworld, they could strip him of his power. 10 chains were wrapped around him, and he was locked away in a dark basement cell, isolated from the world. The authorities were sure their plan would work, but they had no idea they were about to face the legend of Harlem himself. The FBI had been after Bumpy for years, wanting to destroy his empire, and they thought they had succeeded when they locked him away. But what they didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a force of nature. He didn't break. He survived. And in a twist of fate that no one could have predicted, just 3 hours after being buried alive in that basement, the guards found Bumpy calmly playing a piano in the warden's office. The moment Bumpy stepped out of those chains, he would show the world that no one, not even the most powerful institution in the country, could ever break him. This is the story of how the legend of Bumpy Johnson grew stronger in the face of unimaginable adversity, and how his enemies learned the hardest lesson of all: never underestimate Harlem's king. Bumpy Johnson was more than just a criminal. He was a symbol of Harlem's unyielding spirit, a man who had fought his way from the streets to become the kingpin of the underworld. His empire wasn't just built on violence and fear, but on respect and loyalty. People in Harlem didn't follow Bumpy because they had to. They followed him because they believed in him. The FBI and the prison system saw Bumpy only as a criminal. To them, he was a threat that needed to be eliminated. They thought that by taking him off the streets and locking him away, they could destroy the force that had shaped Harlem for so many years. But they failed to realize that Bumpy was more than just a man. He was the spirit of Harlem itself, and you couldn't lock away a city's spirit. To the authorities, Bumpy was public enemy number 1. His numbers game was worth millions. His network stretched far beyond Harlem, and his influence had reached into the very heart of the political and legal systems. They believed that by breaking him, they would destroy his empire, but they underestimated him. They didn't realize that Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. The FBI and the prison system thought they could break Bumpy because they had the power to put him in chains. They thought that with enough pressure, he would crack. But Bumpy wasn't a man who could be intimidated. They didn't understand that his power wasn't in the physical realm. It was in his mind. Bumpy was more than just a man of muscle. He was a master of strategy and patience. The deeper meaning behind the FBI's move was clear. They weren't just trying to take down Bumpy. They were trying to erase the symbol of resistance that he represented. Harlem's pride, its fight for survival, its culture. Bumpy was a living embodiment of that. And when the authorities decided to lock him away in solitary confinement, they were declaring that they could control Harlem's power. They believed they had crossed a line that Bumpy could never return from. But what they didn't realize was that they had just awakened the true power of Harlem's king. The moral line had been crossed the moment they thought they could erase Bumpy. He wasn't just a criminal to be locked away. He was a man who stood for something bigger than himself, something that couldn't be buried by chains or walls. He stood for the people of Harlem, for the culture, and for the streets that refused to be silenced. And when they crossed that line, they sealed their fate. The inevitable confrontation was coming. Bumpy was never going to stay in that basement. The moment he was locked away, he started plotting his return. He would make them pay for their arrogance, for their attempt to crush Harlem's spirit. And when he walked out, he would prove to them that no one, not the FBI, not the government, not anyone could ever hold him down. It started the night Bumpy Johnson was taken from his apartment. The FBI, having tracked him for weeks, moved in with military precision, swooping in and capturing him in a raid that left the people of Harlem in shock. 10 chains were used to restrain him, as if they believed that such heavy shackles could keep a man like Bumpy from ever rising again. They were wrong. They didn't realize that Bumpy wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a survivor. The moment they threw him in that basement cell, Bumpy started planning. He wasn't going to just survive this. He was going to make them regret the day they thought they could lock him away. Bumpy spent the first few hours in the basement, his mind racing with possibilities. He had always known that his enemies would come for him one day, but they had no idea what they were up against. While the prison guards and FBI agents celebrated what they thought was their victory, Bumpy calmly observed. He knew this wasn't just about escaping, it was about showing them that Harlem's spirit couldn't be contained. In the dead of night, Bumpy made his move. He had already spent years in solitary confinement, learning how to survive in extreme isolation. And now, in the quiet of the basement, he began to pick the locks on the chains, one by one. He had no panic in him, just quiet resolve. It was only a matter of time before he was free. By the time Bumpy was freed from the chains, the word had already spread like wildfire across Harlem. The FBI thought they had broken him, but the moment Bumpy stepped into the warden's office, it was clear. They had made a fatal mistake. Bumpy didn't run for cover. He didn't try to escape. Instead, he walked straight to the warden's office, his mind as calm as ever. The warden, who had been relishing the thought of seeing Bumpy locked away for good, was in for a surprise. Bumpy sat at the warden's desk, leaned back in the chair, and lit a cigar. He was no longer a man who needed to fight with fists or guns. His presence alone was enough to send a message. The FBI may have locked him away, but they had just released something far more powerful: the reputation of Harlem's king. The FBI and the prison guards were too busy celebrating their so-called victory to realize what had just happened. Bumpy was in the warden's office, and as they rushed in to check on their prize, they found only an empty chair and the faint smell of a cigar. For a few tense moments, they thought they had caught a break. But Bumpy Johnson was never someone to be underestimated. What they didn't know was that his absence wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of his return. The FBI and the prison authorities were in a state of panic. They had underestimated the depth of Bumpy Johnson's influence and resolve. The moment they realized Bumpy had slipped from their grasp, their confidence began to crumble. They thought that by keeping him chained in that basement, they could break him. But instead, they had played directly into his hands. Bumpy was already a step ahead. While they scrambled to cover their tracks, he calmly executed the plan he had been preparing all along. The same way he had survived in Harlem's underworld, using brains over brawn, he now turned that same strategic thinking to his escape. Bumpy had known that if he wanted to make them pay for their arrogance, he had to strike when they least expected it. They believed they had locked him away for good. But Bumpy wasn't going to just escape. He was going to reclaim his power and show them that Harlem's king was untouchable. Using his network, Bumpy silently reached out to his allies within the system. The guards who had once thought they held all the power now found themselves unknowingly helping to set the stage for Bumpy's return. With the right connections, Bumpy's allies infiltrated key positions in the prison system, disabling security systems and infiltrating communication lines. No one in the FBI or the prison authorities had any idea that Bumpy was already being freed from his chains, not just physically, but mentally. In those next few hours, Bumpy's allies made it look like they were simply following orders. They gave the illusion of control, all the while knowing that the trap was being set. It wasn't just about escaping the chains. It was about making sure that Bumpy would be in charge when the dust settled. The FBI believed they had him cornered, but Bumpy had already executed his counterplay. With his freedom, he wasn't running from anything. He was on a mission to show them that no matter how deep they buried him, Bumpy Johnson was a force that could never be erased. It was 3 hours after Bumpy had freed himself from the chains and the basement that the guards entered the warden's office to check on their prize. They had believed Bumpy to be locked away, isolated, broken. But when they arrived, they found only an empty chair, a table littered with papers, and the lingering scent of cigar smoke. Confusion turned to panic. The warden had spent years trying to break Bumpy, but now the prison was on high alert. Where was Bumpy? How had he escaped? They had him chained, bound, buried in a basement, and yet he had slipped from their grasp like a shadow. Outside the prison, the word was already spreading across Harlem like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson, the kingpin who had once controlled everything from the streets to the underworld, was free again. And those who had once feared him would soon learn that Bumpy was never to be underestimated. As the FBI scrambled to make sense of the situation, they didn't realize that Bumpy's plan was already unfolding. With every passing minute, the distance between the FBI's false sense of security and their inevitable reckoning grew larger. They thought they had trapped him in the basement, but they had only dug their own grave. At exactly 6:15 p.m., Bumpy entered the prison gates again, not as a prisoner, but as a mastermind. He moved through the halls with the same calculated calmness that had made him untouchable in Harlem's streets. His steps were deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't rushing to escape. He was walking directly into the heart of his enemy's stronghold. The warden, panicked and furious, watched from the security room as Bumpy walked past the guards, unchallenged. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They had lost control. Bumpy walked into the warden's office once again, this time with no chains, no fear, and no one to stop him. The warden's attempts to maintain order crumbled as Bumpy sat down at the desk, his desk, with the same confidence that had made him king of Harlem. He was no longer a prisoner. He was the man in charge, and he was here to deliver a simple message. I told you. You can't bury a man who's already been to hell, Bumpy said, his voice calm and steady. The guards who had once tried to intimidate him now stood in silence, unwilling to meet his gaze. The warden's defiance melted into fear. What do you want, Bumpy? You can't do this. You can't walk out of here like you own the place. Bumpy slowly lit a cigar, taking a long drag before responding. I don't need to own anything. Harlem already knows who I am, and you'll never forget what happens when you try to lock me down. The warden's mouth went dry, realizing that Bumpy's power wasn't just in his hands. It was in his mind, his presence, and his legacy. Harlem's king had just reclaimed his throne, and anyone who stood in his way would learn that Harlem didn't bow to anyone. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation. The warden, though once so confident in his position, now understood the full extent of his mistake. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just any criminal. He was a symbol of defiance, a man who stood for something far greater than the laws that tried to chain him. As Bumpy sat at the desk, the guards and warden were left powerless. Their earlier bravado, their overconfidence in their ability to break him, had vanished. There was only one thing left to do now: face the consequences of their actions. Bumpy didn't need to raise a finger. The power he held wasn't in brute force, but in the certainty of his control. The moment the Warden realized Bumpy's true power, his arrogance evaporated. Bumpy had already delivered justice, not by violence, but by simply existing. He was back, and the system that had tried to break him had just cracked under its own weight. "I'm going to tell you something once," Bumpy said, calmly, looking the Warden directly in the eyes. "You think you can control a man like me, but you can't. You tried to break Harlem's king, but what you didn't know was that I am Harlem." The Warden finally bowed his head, understanding the message loud and clear. Bumpy wasn't just a man who survived. He was the embodiment of Harlem's spirit. And in that moment, Harlem's king had reclaimed his place. The impact of that day reverberated throughout Harlem. Word spread quickly that Bumpy Johnson was no longer a man to be contained. The people who had once feared the authorities now stood taller, knowing that Harlem had a protector who could not be broken. For the prison authorities, the humiliation was profound. They had thought they could control Harlem's king, but Bumpy had reminded them that power wasn't about chains. It was about control over yourself, and Bumpy had it in spades. The legend of Bumpy Johnson grew that day. Harlem's king wasn't just a man who had survived prison. He was a man who had mastered survival, using it as a weapon against anyone who tried to break him. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. Bumpy Johnson's story isn't just about surviving. It's about showing the world that nothing, no chain, no system, no authority could break his spirit. In that moment, when he sat in the warden's chair, smoking his cigar, he wasn't just showing the prison guards who was in charge. He was showing Harlem and the world that respect and power could never be taken from a man who knew his worth. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot. The moments that made him a legend. The code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Bumpy Johnson in that moment? Would you have delivered justice the same way? More legendary stories coming next day. Don't miss it.